The USS Greeneville, SSN 772, was a Los Angeles-class fast attack submarine commissioned by the United States Navy on February 16, 1996. Named after Greeneville, Tennessee, the submarine represented one of the most advanced undersea warfare vessels of its time. Designed during the Cold War, the Los Angeles-class submarines were built primarily for tracking and, if necessary, destroying enemy submarines and surface ships. By 2001, Greeneville was part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, operating from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, under Submarine Squadron 1. At the start of 2001, the Greeneville had been in service for nearly 5 years. It measured 360 feet in length, displaced over 6,900 tons when submerged, and could reach speeds exceeding 30 knots underwater. The submarine's nuclear propulsion system allowed it to remain submerged for extended periods, limited primarily by food and crew endurance rather than fuel. The crew, typically numbering about 110 personnel, included both enlisted sailors and officers specializing in navigation, engineering, sonar operations, and weapons systems. In early February 2001, Greeneville was commanded by Commander Scott Waddell, a career submariner with over 2 decades of experience. Waddell was well regarded within the submarine community and was known for maintaining strict operational standards. The vessel's schedule included a series of local operations off the coast of Oahu. Among these was a Distinguished Visitor Embark, a practice used by the Navy to showcase submarine operations to civilians, often influential figures from business, academia, or government. These events were intended to foster public understanding of naval missions and to maintain civilian-military relations. The Greeneville's civilian embark on February 9, 2001, included 16 guests, among them business executives and local civic leaders. The purpose was to demonstrate the submarine's operational capabilities during a short at-sea exercise. The activities planned included simulated emergency procedures, periscope demonstrations, and controlled maneuvers. While these demonstrations were routine and well established in naval tradition, they required careful supervision to ensure adherence to safety procedures. The Ehime Maru, by contrast, was a Japanese high school training vessel operated by the Uwajima Fisheries High School in Ehime Prefecture, Shikoku, Japan. The ship, launched in 1996, was a 190-foot-long steel-hulled training ship designed for both educational and research purposes. It carried a complement of 35 people, including 20 students, 13 crew members, and 2 instructors. The vessel was used to teach students practical skills in navigation, fishing, marine engineering, and oceanographic observation. The Ehime Maru routinely sailed on long training voyages, giving students real-world experience in operating maritime equipment and conducting ocean resource studies. In early 2001, the Ehime Maru embarked on a voyage that would take it to Hawaii for practical training and international exchange. Its captain, 47-year-old Kazuo Ando, was a veteran mariner with extensive experience in training and navigation. The vessel's crew followed a structured educational program that combined classroom instruction with practical seamanship exercises. The presence of teenage students on board reflected Japan's long-standing tradition of vocational education in maritime schools, where training voyages formed an essential part of the curriculum. The Ehime Maru departed Honolulu Harbor on the morning of February 9, 2001. The weather conditions were favorable, and visibility was good. The vessel was in the early stages of its training schedule, with students participating in deck operations and navigation exercises. The ship's route took it south of Oahu, an area frequently used for naval training by U.S. submarines departing Pearl Harbor. While the Ehime Maru and Greeneville operated independently, both were within the same general maritime region. The southern waters off Oahu served as a multi-purpose zone for both civilian and military vessels. The area was known for its depth and clear navigation channels, making it suitable for both training and submarine exercises. The U.S. Navy maintained operational control over portions of this region, but civilian vessels were also permitted to transit freely through designated zones. On that day, the Greeneville had departed Pearl Harbor for a one-day demonstration cruise. The presence of 16 civilian guests required adjustments to the normal crew operations. Civilians were not allowed to handle controls directly, but they were often shown operational procedures. The submarine's officers were responsible for ensuring safety and adherence to established Navy regulations. The Greeneville's operational profile included several planned maneuvers, one of which was an emergency main ballast blow. This procedure rapidly expels water from the ballast tanks using high-pressure air, causing the submarine to ascend quickly to the surface. The maneuver, while safe under controlled conditions, carried inherent risks if not conducted with precise situational awareness. It was typically performed in clear waters after confirming that no surface ships were nearby. By the morning of February 9, 2001, both vessels were engaged in their respective activities. The Ehime Maru continued its training program, maintaining a steady course at approximately 10 knots. Students and instructors were on deck, performing navigation and fishing exercises. The crew followed standard watch procedures, keeping lookout positions as per maritime regulations. Simultaneously, the Greeneville conducted various demonstrations for its guests. The submarine had already performed simulated periscope operations and underwater maneuvers. According to later records, the crew maintained communication with surface control centers but did not receive any warnings of nearby vessels. However, the dense traffic south of Oahu required continuous vigilance from all ships operating in the area. The two vessels represented distinct maritime cultures and purposes. The Greeneville symbolized advanced U.S. naval technology and strategic defense capabilities developed during decades of Cold War competition. The Ehime Maru, in contrast, reflected Japan's educational and maritime heritage, emphasizing hands-on learning and practical seamanship. Both operated under disciplined structures, but with fundamentally different missions. One focused on military readiness and the other on education and training. In historical context, the U.S. Navy's practice of hosting civilian guests on submarines had long been part of its outreach and transparency initiatives. However, it also introduced challenges in maintaining strict operational discipline when balancing demonstration objectives with safety. For the Ehime Maru, voyages near foreign naval bases were not unusual, as Japan maintained cooperative maritime relations with the United States. The waters around Hawaii had hosted numerous Japanese research and training vessels over the years without incident. In terms of design, the Greeneville's sonar system was among the most advanced in the world. It used both passive and active sonar arrays to detect surface and subsurface contacts. The system required experienced sonar technicians to interpret acoustic data, especially in busy maritime environments. Any misidentification or failure to track surface vessels could lead to hazardous situations. The Ehime Maru, while equipped with standard navigation and radar systems, did not have the capability to detect submarines operating deep below the surface. Its operations relied primarily on visual lookout and radar detection of visible contacts. Both vessels' crews were following normal operational schedules that day. The Greeneville's command staff was under pressure to conduct an impressive demonstration for their civilian guests, ensuring all scheduled exercises were completed within the limited time at sea. The Ehime Maru's focus remained on its students' training exercises. There was no reason for either vessel to anticipate danger, as neither had received warnings of nearby operations that would interfere with their routes. The background of the two crews also highlights the broader context of U.S.-Japan relations at the time. By 2001, Japan and the United States maintained one of the closest defense partnerships in the world, with frequent joint naval exercises and shared use of Pacific training ranges. Both nations had extensive maritime experience and professional standards, emphasizing safety and communication. The Pacific waters south of Oahu symbolized that cooperation, a region where U.S. and Japanese vessels routinely passed without conflict. The Greeneville's demonstration cruise was scheduled to last only a few hours, after which the submarine would return to Pearl Harbor. The civilian visitors would observe operations from designated areas, and selected maneuvers would be performed to showcase the submarine's power and control systems. Commander Waddell and his officers had conducted similar embarks in the past without incident. The Ehime Maru, meanwhile, continued its routine voyage, unaware that a U.S. submarine was conducting exercises nearby. Its crew and students were focused on navigational tasks, recording sea conditions, and carrying out training drills under the supervision of instructors. Their voyage represented an educational milestone for the young students on board, many of whom were experiencing international waters for the first time. The presence of both vessels in the same maritime area on that particular day was a convergence of routine schedules, a U.S. Navy public relations exercise and a Japanese educational voyage. Both were lawful and well within their respective maritime rights. The circumstances leading up to their encounter were ordinary from an operational perspective, with no indication of impending danger. By the afternoon of February 9th, both ships were operating independently off the southern coast of Oahu. The Greeneville's crew prepared for its final demonstration maneuver of the day, while the Ehime Maru's students continued their training drills. The Pacific waters were calm, and visibility remained clear. The two vessels, one representing the technological power of the United States Navy, the other embodying Japan's maritime education system, were unknowingly operating within the same sector of ocean that would, within minutes, become the site of one of the most tragic maritime accidents in peacetime history. On the morning of February 9th, 2001, the USS Greeneville SSN 772 departed from Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, under the command of Commander Scott Waddell. The submarine carried a total of 109 people, 98 crew members, and 16 civilian guests invited to observe a demonstration of submarine operations. The Greeneville was scheduled to conduct a short at-sea demonstration and return to base by late afternoon. The submarine's crew began routine preparations before departure, including safety checks, navigation setup, and verification of operational systems. The Greeneville left Pearl Harbor at approximately 8 a.m. and headed south toward an area about 10 to 12 miles off the coast of Oahu, commonly used by the Navy for training and demonstration exercises. Weather and sea conditions were favorable, with calm seas and good visibility. The submarine descended to operating depth after clearing harbor waters and began its series of scheduled demonstrations for the visitors. The civilian guests included business executives and local civic figures, some of whom had personal or professional connections to the Navy. During the voyage, they were escorted around various compartments of the submarine and given explanations of its capabilities. The ship's officers conducted a standard agenda of activities meant to showcase submarine life, including periscope operations, torpedo room tours, and navigation procedures. Commander Waddell remained responsible for all decisions made during the cruise. The civilian guests were under strict rules not to operate any equipment, but several were invited to observe certain control stations under supervision. By late morning, the Greeneville had successfully completed the majority of its demonstration items and began preparations for its final scheduled maneuver, an emergency main ballast blow. This procedure was designed to demonstrate how a submarine could rapidly surface in an emergency. The emergency blow was typically performed under controlled conditions and required full awareness of surrounding maritime traffic. Before initiating such a maneuver, standard Navy procedures required a periscope and sonar sweep to ensure that the surface above was clear of vessels. The submarine's fire control and sonar operators were responsible for tracking all contacts in the area. At approximately 12:45 p.m., the crew began the preparatory steps for the emergency blow. The submarine was operating at a depth of roughly 400 feet. In the control room, several of the civilian guests were present, including a few standing near the command chair and the plainsman stations. The sonar team had been monitoring the surrounding area for potential surface contacts. According to later investigation reports, the sonar operators detected multiple contacts earlier in the day, but contact classification and updates were not consistently maintained during the busy demonstration schedule. At 12:50 p.m., the submarine came to periscope depth to conduct a final visual sweep. Commander Waddell and several guests were in the control room at the time. The officer of the deck raised the periscope and began a scan of the surface. The periscope sweep, which normally required several minutes to ensure a full 360-degree scan, was completed in less than half a minute. The abbreviated scan was attributed to time constraints and the presence of civilians in the control area. No surface vessels were reported in the immediate vicinity during that brief observation. Unbeknownst to the Greeneville's crew, the Japanese fishing training vessel Ehime Maru was operating approximately 9 nautical miles south of Oahu in the same general sector. The Ehime Maru was traveling at about 10 knots on a steady course, conducting crew and student training. At this time, the vessel's radar and lookout teams observed no unusual activity. The ship maintained standard navigation procedures, unaware of the submarine's position below. At approximately 1:42 p.m., the Greeneville's command team initiated the emergency ballast blow. The maneuver involved rapidly venting compressed air into the main ballast tanks, forcing water out and causing the submarine to ascend quickly. The control room personnel included Commander Waddell, Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Gerald Pfeiffer, Chief of the Boat Master Chief John Miralles, and several crew members assigned to operate the ballast controls. Some of the civilian guests stood nearby to observe the rapid ascent procedure. The submarine's angle of ascent increased sharply as high-pressure air forced the submarine upward. The bow rose at a steep angle, between 30 and 40 degrees, accelerating toward the surface at a rapid rate. The maneuver was designed to be visually impressive, illustrating the power of the submarine's buoyancy control system. The crew monitored depth readings as the vessel ascended, with the expectation of surfacing in an area clear of surface traffic. At 1:43 p.m., within seconds of breaking the surface, the Greeneville's bow struck the underside of the Ehime Maru. The collision occurred approximately 9 miles south of Diamond Head, at coordinates roughly 21 degrees 0 minutes north, 157 degrees 48 minutes west. The impact tore a massive hole into the Japanese vessel's stern section. The Ehime Maru's engine room and aft compartments flooded almost immediately. The ship's stern began to sink within seconds of the collision. The Ehime Maru's crew and students on deck felt the violent jolt of the impact and saw the submarine's dark hull emerge beside them. The vessel listed sharply to starboard as water rushed into the breached compartments. The students and instructors attempted to reach lifeboats and life jackets, but the rapid flooding left little time for organized evacuation. The entire ship sank within approximately 5 minutes of the collision, disappearing beneath the surface at about 1:48 p.m. The Greeneville's crew realized immediately that a surface ship had been struck. Upon surfacing, the submarine's officers saw debris and people in the water. Commander Waddell ordered an immediate halt to propulsion and initiated emergency response procedures. Crew members rushed to the bridge and deck areas to search for survivors. The submarine's crew deployed life rings and inflatable rafts while radioing for assistance from the Coast Guard and nearby vessels. At the moment of impact, there were 35 people aboard the Ehime Maru, 13 crew members, 2 instructors, and 20 students. Within minutes, most of those on deck were thrown into the water. The survivors clung to floating debris or were assisted by the Greeneville's rescue efforts. Nearby civilian vessels, alerted by distress calls, began heading toward the location to assist. By 2 p.m., U.S. Navy and Coast Guard assets were notified and began search and rescue operations. Helicopters from Naval Air Station Barbers Point and Coast Guard cutters were dispatched to the scene. The Greeneville remained on the surface, its crew continuing to recover survivors from the water. 9 people from the Ehime Maru were missing, including 4 high school students, 2 instructors, and 3 crew members. 26 survivors were rescued from the water and transported to Oahu for medical evaluation. Within the Greeneville, the mood shifted from a demonstration environment to an emergency response. Civilian guests who had witnessed the collision were moved to safe compartments while the command staff coordinated communication with higher naval authorities. Commander Waddell reported the incident to Submarine Squadron 1 headquarters at Pearl Harbor, providing initial details and requesting immediate assistance. The Navy's chain of command quickly initiated a crisis response protocol. The first Coast Guard helicopter arrived on the scene shortly after 2:30 p.m., followed by additional aircraft and rescue vessels. Debris from the Ehime Maru, including lifeboats, wooden planks, and personal items, floated on the surface. Divers confirmed that the Japanese vessel had sunk rapidly in deep water, approximately 600 meters below the surface, making immediate recovery impossible. The U.S. Navy's initial focus was on locating survivors. Search operations continued throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The survivors reported that the Ehime Maru had gone down stern first, with little time for organized evacuation. Many students and crew were below deck at the time of the collision, leaving them trapped as the ship flooded. Witness statements described the impact as sudden and catastrophic, with no warning or opportunity to avoid the collision. On board the Greeneville, preliminary assessments began immediately. The submarine sustained only minor superficial damage to its bow and sonar dome. The physical damage was consistent with a glancing upward strike to a surface vessel's hull. Despite the limited damage to the submarine, the human cost was severe. By late afternoon, U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Thomas Fargo had been briefed on the incident. The Navy initiated an immediate investigation to determine the cause of the collision. All civilian guests were confined aboard the submarine during the initial phase of inquiry, and statements from the crew were collected as soon as the vessel returned to port. The Greeneville docked at Pearl Harbor later that evening, under strict security and public scrutiny. At sea, Coast Guard and Navy ships maintained search operations into the night, deploying sonar and underwater cameras to attempt to locate the wreck. The depth of the wreck site, approximately 2,000 feet, presented significant challenges for recovery. Despite extensive searching, no additional survivors were found after the initial rescue. Japanese authorities were informed of the incident through diplomatic channels that same day. The Ehime Maru's home institution, Uwajima Fisheries High School, received confirmation of the sinking and loss of life by the evening of February 9th. The Japanese government began coordinating with U.S. officials for detailed information on the event and the ongoing search for missing persons. Later testimony and investigations revealed that the Greeneville's crew had been under time pressure to complete the demonstration schedule and return to port. Several procedural steps, including extended sonar monitoring and a full periscope sweep, had been abbreviated. Civilian guests were present in the control room during the final minutes before the emergency blow. These conditions became central to the later inquiries into the cause of the collision. By 6 p.m., the search operations had been expanded to include multiple Navy and Coast Guard vessels. The wreck of the Ehime Maru was confirmed through sonar imaging the following day. It rested upright on the ocean floor, its stern section heavily damaged from the impact. The position and condition of the wreck confirmed that the Greeneville's rapid ascent had struck the vessel almost directly beneath its engine room. The immediate events of February 9, 2001, thus unfolded within a narrow time frame of just over an hour, from the start of the final maneuver to the total loss of the Ehime Maru. The collision occurred during a routine demonstration, under favorable weather and visibility, in waters that both vessels had legal rights to operate within. The Greeneville's emergency blow, performed without complete situational awareness, directly led to the sinking of a civilian training ship carrying students and instructors. The tragedy resulted in the deaths of 9 people and marked one of the most serious peacetime naval accidents involving the United States Navy and a foreign civilian vessel. The events of that day would form the factual foundation for subsequent investigations and diplomatic exchanges, which would unfold in the months that followed. Immediately after the collision on February 9, 2001, the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard initiated one of the most urgent maritime rescue operations in Hawaiian waters in decades. The USS Greeneville SSN 772, which had surfaced moments after striking the Japanese training ship Ehime Maru, was the first vessel on scene to begin emergency recovery. Commander Scott Waddell ordered his crew to deploy all available flotation devices and begin scanning the surface for survivors. At approximately 1:46 p.m., the Greeneville's bridge crew reported multiple people and debris in the surrounding area. The submarine's crew threw life rings, inflatable rafts, and buoyant materials into the water to assist survivors struggling to stay afloat. The submarine's communications officer transmitted an emergency message to U.S. Coast Guard District 14, reporting a collision with a foreign vessel and requesting immediate assistance. The distress call was received by the Coast Guard Operations Center in Honolulu at approximately 1:47 p.m. Within minutes, the Coast Guard dispatched response units from Barbers Point Air Station and nearby cutters stationed at Oahu. Search and rescue helicopters were launched, and surface vessels already operating in the vicinity were redirected to the site. The U.S. Navy also activated its rescue coordination network, ordering nearby ships and aircraft to assist. The first Coast Guard aircraft arrived at the location within 30 minutes of the distress call. The crew observed a large debris field, oil slicks, and survivors clinging to floating wreckage. The Ehime Maru had already sunk completely by that time, leaving no visible trace of the vessel itself. The aircraft crew began dropping additional life rafts and marking survivor positions with smoke signals for surface vessels. By 2:20 p.m., the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Assateague was en route, followed by the patrol boat Galveston Island. 2 Navy vessels, the Salvor and the Safeguard, were also deployed from Pearl Harbor. The Greeneville remained stationary at the surface, its crew continuing rescue operations under Commander Waddell's direction. Several crew members entered the water with safety lines to assist survivors too weak to climb onto flotation gear. 26 people were rescued from the sea within the first hour. The survivors included crew members, instructors, and students from the Ehime Maru. They were brought aboard rescue boats and the Greeneville. Navy medical personnel provided immediate aid, treating survivors for shock, hypothermia, and minor injuries. Helicopters began airlifting survivors to medical facilities in Honolulu by approximately 3 p.m. Despite extensive surface searches, 9 individuals remained unaccounted for. The missing included 4 students, 2 teachers, and 3 members of the ship's professional crew. Survivors reported that those below deck at the time of impact had little chance to escape as the ship sank rapidly. The sinking occurred so quickly that the vessel's stern went down within minutes, trapping anyone still inside the lower compartments. At 3:30 p.m., the Navy established an official incident command center at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Thomas Fargo, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, assumed overall coordination of the response. Rear Admiral William Clem, commander of Submarine Force Pacific, oversaw submarine-related aspects of the situation. The U.S. Coast Guard maintained control of search and rescue operations, while the Navy provided ships, divers, and aircraft to support the effort. By late afternoon, the scope of the disaster became clear. Early reports from survivors confirmed that Ehime Maru was a Japanese high school training vessel from Uwajima Fisheries High School in Ehime Prefecture. The presence of teenage students on board intensified the urgency and sensitivity of the incident. The U.S. Navy notified the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, providing details on the number of missing persons and the ongoing search efforts. At 4 p.m., Japanese officials were informed that the ship had been lost and that several students were among the missing. The Japanese consul general in Honolulu, Hisao Yamaguchi, traveled to the command center to meet with Admiral Fargo and Coast Guard officials. Communication was established with Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which began coordinating its response and collecting information from the school in Uwajima. The U.S. Navy immediately restricted information about the incident to verified facts. Media outlets in Hawaii began reporting the collision by the evening of February 9th, citing statements from the Coast Guard and eyewitnesses. Local news stations showed footage of survivors being brought to shore and helicopters searching the area south of Oahu. By 6 p.m., the rescue operation transitioned into an expanded search phase. The Navy deployed sonar-equipped vessels to attempt to locate the sunken Ehime Maru. The depth in the area, measured at approximately 2,000 feet, made traditional diving operations impossible. Specialized equipment was required to detect the wreck. That evening, the Navy submarine support ship USS Salvor began using side-scan sonar to map the seafloor in the suspected impact area. The survivors of the Ehime Maru were taken to the Coast Guard base at Barbers Point, where they received medical care, dry clothing, and food. Japanese-speaking Navy personnel and translators were brought in to assist. Many of the survivors were in shock and unable to fully describe the events leading to the sinking. The Japanese consulate arranged for immediate contact with families in Japan, informing them that some of the crew and students had been rescued. That same night, the U.S. Navy informed the families of the Greeneville crew and the civilian guests about the incident. All civilian guests aboard the submarine were interviewed individually by Navy investigators and medical personnel. The Navy suspended all non-essential operations for the Greeneville pending the outcome of the investigation. At sea, search and rescue continued through the night under difficult conditions. Coast Guard aircraft maintained illumination of the area using flares, while ships conducted grid-pattern sweeps to locate survivors or debris. Divers were not deployed due to depth limitations. By midnight, no additional survivors or remains had been located. On the morning of February 10th, sonar imaging confirmed the presence of the Ehime Maru wreck on the seafloor, approximately 2,000 feet below the surface. The wreck was located upright, with the stern section heavily damaged. The discovery ended hopes of finding further survivors. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard formally shifted the mission from rescue to recovery and investigation. News of the collision spread rapidly through Japan by February 10th local time. Major Japanese television networks and newspapers reported that a U.S. Navy submarine had sunk a Japanese high school training ship near Hawaii, resulting in the deaths of students and teachers. The initial reaction in Japan was one of disbelief and grief. The Uwajima Fisheries High School community was devastated as news reached families of the missing students. The Japanese government requested full cooperation from the United States in investigating the cause and recovering the victims' remains. In Hawaii, local authorities assisted in providing accommodations and care for the survivors. The Japanese consulate organized transportation for them to Honolulu, where they were housed temporarily before arrangements were made to return them to Japan. The survivors gave preliminary statements to Japanese officials and the U.S. Navy. By the afternoon of February 10th, Admiral Fargo publicly confirmed that 9 people were missing and presumed dead. The U.S. Navy released an official statement expressing regret and pledging full cooperation with Japan in the aftermath. Commander Waddell also submitted his initial report, acknowledging that the Greeneville had been conducting an emergency ballast blow when the collision occurred. The immediate aftermath of the accident placed both the U.S. and Japanese governments under intense public and media scrutiny. In the United States, questions emerged about why civilian guests had been present during a potentially risky submarine maneuver. In Japan, the focus was on the loss of life and the emotional toll on the victims' families. Japanese Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori received official notification from U.S. Ambassador Thomas Foley and called for a detailed explanation and accountability from the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Pacific Fleet continued search operations for several days following the sinking. More than 15 vessels and multiple aircraft participated in the effort. Debris from the Ehime Maru continued to surface, including life jackets, textbooks, and personal items belonging to the students and crew. These items were collected and documented by recovery teams and later returned to Japanese authorities. By February 12th, the search for survivors was officially suspended. The focus shifted entirely to recovering the remains of the missing. The U.S. Navy acknowledged that due to the depth of the wreck, recovery would require advanced equipment not available in Hawaii. The Navy began consulting with deep-sea recovery experts and contractors to explore options for locating and retrieving the victims. During the first week after the incident, Japanese officials and family members of the victims traveled to Hawaii. Memorial services were held near Honolulu for the missing, attended by U.S. and Japanese representatives. The Navy provided full logistical support for the families, arranging transportation to the search area and meetings with senior naval officers. Media coverage in both countries intensified as more details emerged. In Japan, newspapers such as Yomiuri Shimbun and Asahi Shimbun ran front-page stories emphasizing the loss of young students and questioning U.S. Navy procedures. In the United States, outlets such as the New York Times and Los Angeles Times reported on the growing diplomatic tension and the ongoing investigation. Television footage of grieving families and the debris field off Oahu brought global attention to the tragedy. By mid-February 2001, the U.S. Navy completed the initial phase of its response, having accounted for all survivors and established the official list of the missing. The Navy provided the Japanese government with detailed maps of the wreck location and a full timeline of search efforts. Both governments agreed to cooperate on potential recovery operations once technical feasibility was confirmed. The immediate aftermath of the Ehime Maru sinking thus encompassed an intense multinational rescue effort, rapid diplomatic coordination, and significant public reaction. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard mobilized extensive resources within hours of the collision, rescuing 26 survivors and confirming the loss of 9. Coordination between American and Japanese authorities began almost immediately, laying the groundwork for continued communication and investigation. The tragedy's human toll and the sensitive nature of the victims, teenage students and their instructors, made the event one of the most emotionally charged maritime incidents in peacetime U.S.-Japan relations. The rescue and initial aftermath phase concluded with both nations committed to cooperation, yet facing growing questions about responsibility, procedure, and accountability that would soon dominate the diplomatic and public discourse. The collision between the USS Greeneville and the Ehime Maru triggered one of the most closely scrutinized naval investigations in U.S. peacetime history. Within hours of the accident, the U.S. Navy began formal inquiries to determine how a modern nuclear-powered submarine had struck and sunk a civilian fishing vessel in clear daylight near the coast of Hawaii. The case rapidly evolved into an international matter, involving not only military accountability, but also diplomatic sensitivity between the United States and Japan. Immediately following the rescue operations, the Navy initiated a preliminary review under the command of Rear Admiral Charles Griffiths, the commander of Submarine Group 9. His first task was to collect statements from the Greeneville's crew and civilian visitors, reconstruct the submarine's operations on February 9, 2001, and assess potential violations of established procedures. Early reports indicated that the submarine had been conducting a Distinguished Visitor (DV) embarkation, a program meant to familiarize civilians with naval operations and foster public relations. On that day, 16 civilian guests were on board, including businessmen and community leaders. This fact became one of the central points of contention in the subsequent investigation. The initial Navy review determined that the collision occurred during an emergency ballast blow maneuver, a rapid ascent procedure used to bring a submarine to the surface quickly. Commander Scott Waddell, the commanding officer of Greeneville, had authorized the demonstration for the benefit of the civilian visitors. Normally, such a maneuver required multiple sonar sweeps, periscope checks, and the verification of a clear area above before surfacing. However, witness statements and later evidence suggested that these safety procedures were either abbreviated or improperly executed. On February 12, 2001, Admiral Thomas Fargo, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, ordered a formal court of inquiry, the highest form of administrative investigation available under Navy regulations. The court convened in Pearl Harbor on March 5, 2001, and was chaired by Vice Admiral John Nathman, with Rear Admiral Paul Sullivan and Rear Admiral David Stone as additional members. The proceedings were open to the public and received extensive media coverage in both the United States and Japan. Over several weeks, the inquiry heard testimony from officers, enlisted personnel, sonar technicians, and civilian guests who had been aboard Greeneville. The inquiry focused on several key operational aspects: sonar detection, periscope observation, situational awareness, and adherence to standard operating procedures. Testimony revealed that the sonar team had detected surface contacts in the minutes before the ballast blow, but that the information was not properly analyzed or communicated. A civilian visitor had been invited to operate the control stick for the maneuver under supervision, which raised additional concerns about the appropriateness of such participation during a potentially hazardous evolution. Commander Waddell accepted responsibility for authorizing the maneuver and permitting civilian involvement, but maintained that he believed the area to be clear of surface traffic based on the information provided to him. Further examination revealed that the submarine's sonar system had, in fact, detected the Ehime Maru shortly before the ascent. However, the contact was classified as a distant or non-threatening vessel, and the data was not updated prior to surfacing. The periscope search was reportedly rushed, lasting only about 60 seconds, which was insufficient for detecting smaller surface ships like the Ehime Maru. The court determined that several procedural steps were omitted or performed inadequately, including a comprehensive sonar sweep and proper communication between the command and control room personnel. During the inquiry, Commander Waddell's testimony drew considerable public attention. He appeared before the court in uniform, taking full personal responsibility for the accident and expressing remorse for the loss of life. He emphasized that no member of his crew acted with ill intent and that his decisions alone led to the tragedy. His defense counsel, Charles Gittins, argued that systemic issues, such as pressure to impress civilian guests and the Navy's own DV program structure contributed to the errors in judgment. Despite the emotional tone of Waddell's testimony, the court focused strictly on procedural accountability and adherence to naval standards. On March 16, 2001, the Court of Inquiry released its findings. The panel concluded that the primary cause of the collision was human error, specifically the failure to conduct adequate periscope and sonar checks prior to surfacing. The court cited deficiencies in command decision-making, communication, and situational awareness. It recommended that Commander Waddell, Lieutenant Commander Gerald Pfeiffer, Executive Officer, and Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Cohen, Officer of the deck, be held accountable. The report also criticized the presence of civilian visitors in the control room during critical operations, identifying it as a significant distraction that compromised safety. Following the court's recommendations, Admiral Fargo relieved Commander Waddell of command and issued letters of reprimand to the executive and navigation officers. The Navy chose not to pursue a court-martial, concluding that administrative punishment was sufficient given the circumstances and Waddell's acceptance of responsibility. Commander Waddell retired from the Navy in October 2001 with an honorable discharge, marking the end of his 20-year career. His public apology to the victims' families later became an important part of the reconciliation process. But at this stage, it represented an official acknowledgement of fault within the U.S. Navy. Parallel to the Navy's internal investigation, diplomatic activity between the United States and Japan intensified. The collision had occurred at a time when U.S.-Japan relations were stable but sensitive, particularly concerning military cooperation and U.S. base operations in Japan. The death of Japanese civilians, including 4 high school students, generated intense public outrage in Japan. The Japanese government, led by Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori, demanded a transparent investigation and direct accountability from the U.S. Navy. Initially, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed frustration at the slow release of information and limited participation in the recovery operations. The U.S. Navy restricted Japanese officials' access to the Greeneville during the inquiry, citing classified systems aboard the submarine. This led to early criticism in Japan that the United States was withholding critical details. As public pressure mounted, both governments took measures to ease tensions. President George W. Bush issued a formal apology to the Japanese government and the families of the victims on February 12th, just 3 days after the accident. The U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Thomas Foley, personally delivered the President's message to Prime Minister Mori, expressing deep regret and offering cooperation in recovery and investigation efforts. In Japan, the collision became front-page news for weeks. Public demonstrations and editorial commentary called for stronger oversight of U.S. military activities in the Pacific. Many criticized the presence of civilians aboard a nuclear-powered submarine engaged in an operational maneuver, viewing it as reckless and disrespectful to international maritime safety norms. The Ehime Prefectural Government and Uwajima Fisheries High School, operators of the Ehime Maru, formally petitioned the Japanese government to ensure accountability and support for the victims' families. The diplomatic handling of the crisis required careful coordination between the Pentagon, the U.S. State Department, and Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The U.S. Navy provided regular updates to Japanese officials and invited representatives to observe aspects of the inquiry. However, certain limitations, such as classified procedures and restricted access to evidence, remained points of contention. Prime Minister Mori faced domestic political pressure to secure tangible results from the U.S. investigation. Meanwhile, the Japanese embassy in Washington received hundreds of letters and petitions demanding justice and the return of the victims' remains. Within the United States, The investigation's transparency also drew scrutiny from Congress and the American media. Several lawmakers questioned the appropriateness of the Navy's DV program, which was suspended indefinitely after the incident. The Pentagon ordered a comprehensive review of all public relations embarkations on submarines and surface ships to prevent future operational distractions. The Navy also examined its training and safety protocols, particularly regarding surfacing maneuvers in areas with civilian maritime traffic. Public reaction to the inquiry's outcome was mixed. Some Americans viewed Commander Waddell's accountability and the Navy's disciplinary actions as appropriate, while others believed that the absence of a court-martial signaled leniency. In Japan, many considered the punishments insufficient, arguing that the U.S. response failed to reflect the gravity of 9 civilian deaths. Japanese newspapers emphasized the emotional toll on the victims' families and the perceived imbalance in how responsibility was addressed between the two nations. Throughout March and April 2001, U.S. officials continued diplomatic outreach to mitigate damage to bilateral relations. High-ranking Navy officers visited Japan to express condolences and explain the results of the inquiry. Admiral Fargo and other Pacific Fleet representatives met with Japanese officials to discuss compensation, recovery efforts, and potential policy changes. The United States formally pledged full cooperation in the recovery of the Ehime Maru and the remains of its victims, though technical and environmental challenges delayed those efforts. The Greeneville investigation also sparked broader discussion within the U.S. military community about the balance between public engagement and operational security. The Distinguished Visitor Program, designed to promote understanding of naval operations, came under heavy review. Subsequent Navy directives restricted such visits during complex or potentially hazardous maneuvers. The case became a precedent for reinforcing strict procedural compliance regardless of external pressures or civilian presence. By mid-2001, the formal inquiry and disciplinary actions had concluded, but diplomatic repercussions continued. The Japanese government maintained close monitoring of U.S. follow-up actions, including memorial services and compensation agreements. The Navy's internal reports were shared with Japan to ensure transparency, and both governments expressed a mutual desire to rebuild trust. The accountability measures, both administrative and diplomatic, were intended to signal a shared recognition of the tragedy and a commitment to preventing future incidents. The Court of Inquiry into the Greeneville-Ehime Maru collision remains one of the most detailed peacetime naval investigations in modern history. Its findings documented a precise sequence of human and procedural failures, highlighting how deviations from established safety practices can lead to catastrophic results even in controlled conditions. The case reshaped naval policy, altered U.S.-Japan military relations, and established new standards for transparency in handling international maritime accidents involving military vessels. Following the formal investigation and disciplinary proceedings, attention shifted to the complex technical and diplomatic challenge of recovering the Ehime Maru from the ocean floor and returning the remains of the victims to their families. The wreck lay approximately 2,000 feet below the surface, roughly 9 nautical miles south of Oahu. From the outset, the recovery operation was recognized as one of the most difficult peacetime underwater salvage missions ever attempted by the U.S. Navy. The Japanese government made repeated requests for the recovery of the Ehime Maru, emphasizing the cultural and emotional importance of returning the bodies of the victims and preserving artifacts for proper mourning. Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs coordinated closely with the U.S. Navy and the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, to determine the feasibility of raising the 830-ton vessel. Technical assessments began in March 2001, shortly after the Court of Inquiry concluded, led by the U.S. Navy's Supervisor of Salvage and Diving, SUPI-SALV. Initial studies confirmed that the wreck was lying upright but severely damaged, with debris scattered across the seabed. Because of the depth and condition of the wreck, a full lifting operation was deemed risky. Traditional salvage techniques were unsuitable for such a fragile structure resting under immense water pressure. Engineers concluded that only a partial recovery, raising the vessel to a shallower location for inspection and recovery of remains, was feasible. After extensive bilateral discussions, the governments of Japan and the United States jointly approved this approach. The mission would be carried out under strict environmental and safety guidelines to prevent the release of fuel oil and other pollutants into Hawaiian waters. The U.S. Navy contracted the Seattle-based firm Crowley Marine Services to provide heavy lift support. The operation centered around a specialized barge equipped with dynamic positioning systems and a 5,000-ton crane. The recovery plan involved attaching lifting slings to the hull of the Ehime Maru using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs. These ROVs, operated from the surface, were tasked with maneuvering around the wreck to secure lifting points without causing structural collapse. The salvage team spent months planning and simulating the process to minimize risks to divers, equipment, and the integrity of the vessel. The recovery operation officially began in August 2001, 6 months after the collision. It was conducted in multiple stages. The first stage focused on relocating the wreck to a shallower area, approximately 1 mile south of Honolulu International Airport, at a depth of about 115 feet. This intermediate depth allowed divers to safely enter the wreck to search for remains and personal effects. The lift from 2,000 feet to 115 feet required precision coordination between cranes, winches, and the ROVs. The process took several days, with continuous monitoring by Navy engineers and Japanese observers. When the Ehime Maru reached the shallower site in early October 2001, Navy divers from Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 1, MDSU-1, began methodical search operations inside the vessel. These divers worked in pairs and followed detailed search maps based on the ship's blueprints provided by Japan. They retrieved human remains, school materials, and other personal belongings of the victims. By late October, the remains of 8 of the 9 missing individuals had been located and respectfully handled. The 9th victim was never recovered. The remains were transferred to Japanese officials in solemn ceremonies conducted at Pearl Harbor, with representatives from both nations in attendance. The recovery of the victims brought significant emotional relief to the families and the people of Japan. Japanese representatives expressed gratitude for the United States' efforts and the care taken during the operation. The Japanese government publicly acknowledged the technical skill and sensitivity displayed by the Navy's salvage teams. The remains and recovered items were returned to Uwajima Fisheries High School and the victims' families in November 2001. Memorial services were held in Ehime Prefecture, attended by local officials, survivors, and relatives of those who had perished. After the remains were recovered, the Ehime Maru was prepared for relocation to its final resting site. In December 2001, the Navy executed the final phase of the operation, moving the wreck to a designated area about 12 miles south of Barbers Point, Oahu, and re-sinking it in 6,000 feet of water. This location was chosen in consultation with the Japanese government, ensuring that the ship would rest undisturbed and that the surrounding environment would not be affected by remaining fuel or debris. The relocation and re-sinking were conducted with ceremonial respect, symbolizing closure for both nations. Throughout the recovery period, close communication between Japanese and U.S. officials helped rebuild diplomatic trust. The Japanese government sent observers to monitor each phase of the operation, and the U.S. Navy provided daily progress reports. Both governments coordinated public communication to ensure accuracy and transparency, preventing misinformation or speculation. The recovery operation cost approximately $60 million, fully funded by the U.S. government as part of its commitment to the victims' families and Japan's request for full cooperation. In early 2002, the Japanese and U.S. governments organized joint memorial events in both Hawaii and Japan. One of the most significant ceremonies took place at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, where Japanese families, survivors, and Navy officials gathered to honor the victims. Commander Scott Waddell, now retired, attended one of the private meetings with the victims' families, offering a direct personal apology. The meeting, arranged by diplomatic channels, was emotionally difficult but was seen as a critical step toward reconciliation. The families of the victims accepted the apology and expressed their wish that the tragedy serve as a lesson in responsibility and safety. The Japanese government used the occasion to honor the memory of the Ehime Maru's crew and students through permanent memorials. In Uwajima City, a stone monument was erected at Uwajima Fisheries High School, listing the names of the 9 who died. Another memorial was placed at Kakako Waterfront Park in Honolulu, overlooking the waters where the accident occurred. Both memorials became annual gathering sites for commemorations attended by Japanese and American officials, naval personnel, and citizens. The Ehime Maru tragedy also had a lasting institutional impact on naval operations and safety procedures. The U.S. Navy conducted a thorough review of its training, public relations, and operational protocols. The Distinguished Visitor (DV) program, which allowed civilians to embark on military vessels, was significantly revised. Civilian participation in submarine operations was prohibited during any maneuver that carried risk. Strict limitations were placed on the scope of non-military guest activities aboard active vessels. These reforms were directly attributed to the lessons learned from the Greeneville incident. In addition to changes in visitor policies, the Navy implemented new procedural standards for submarine surfacing operations. These included mandatory multi-directional periscope sweeps, extended sonar monitoring before ascents, and improved crew training in surface contact identification. The Pacific Fleet introduced enhanced safety oversight measures, including random inspections and operational audits. The Ehime Maru case was added to the curriculum of the Navy's submarine command courses as a study in operational discipline and risk management. From Japan's perspective, the incident became a focal point for discussions about maritime safety education and international accountability. Uwajima Fisheries High School incorporated the Ehime Maru story into its training program to emphasize caution, responsibility, and cooperation in international waters. The Japanese Ministry of Education recognized the event as a national tragedy that underlined the importance of cross-cultural understanding in maritime practices. Diplomatically, the recovery mission and subsequent reconciliation strengthened U.S.-Japan relations after an initial period of tension. The coordinated handling of the operation and the transparent communication restored confidence between the two nations. Both governments characterized the incident as a painful but ultimately cooperative process that reaffirmed mutual respect. The U.S. Navy's willingness to undertake a technically demanding and expensive recovery mission was seen in Japan as an acknowledgement of moral responsibility. In the years that followed, the Ehime Maru tragedy continued to be referenced in academic and military studies concerning crisis management and international relations. Analysts highlighted how the prompt initiation of recovery and diplomatic dialogue prevented a larger rupture in the U.S.-Japan alliance. The case demonstrated the necessity of immediate accountability, direct communication with affected nations, and adherence to cultural sensitivities when accidents occur involving military forces and civilians. Memorial events marking anniversaries of the tragedy have been held annually since 2002. These ceremonies are often attended by Japanese consular officials in Honolulu, representatives of the U.S. Navy, and local Hawaiian community members. They include moments of silence, offering of flowers, and readings of the victims' names. The continuation of these ceremonies symbolizes enduring remembrance and shared responsibility between the two nations. The historical legacy of the Ehime Maru incident extends beyond the technical lessons of submarine operation. It stands as a rare example of large-scale peacetime military accountability involving two allied nations. The event prompted institutional reforms in naval operations and reshaped protocols governing interactions between armed forces and civilians. It reinforced the principle that military professionalism must be guided by caution, discipline, and international responsibility, even in non-combat settings. Over 2 decades later, the name Ehime Maru remains associated with maritime safety awareness and cross-national cooperation. The tragedy is remembered in both Japan and the United States not only as a moment of loss, but as a historical benchmark that redefined how modern navies approach transparency, responsibility, and respect for human life. The meticulous recovery efforts, the public acknowledgement of fault, and the establishment of memorials ensured that the victim's memory would continue to shape the standards of peacetime naval conduct and international reconciliation.